Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is David Wellman, and it is my honor to direct the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University. On behalf of my colleagues and our students, I am very pleased to welcome you to our conference, Diplomacy and the Future of Democracy, Transprofessional Responses to Contemporary Diplomatic Challenges. Over the next 2 days, we will be hearing from both practitioners and scholars of diplomacy who come to the table from multiple vocations, in the name of supporting diplomatic cooperation and collaboration aimed at the promotion and preservation of democracy. As we confront the diplomatic challenges across the globe presented by movements and leaders opposed to liberal democracy, the need for a deeper level of collaboration among all practitioners of diplomacy has never been greater. Given this reality, our conference seeks to respond to the following questions. How can a wide-ranging, more inclusive understanding of diplomacy help us better engage the full range of diplomatic agency available in this current environment? To what degree can the democratization of diplomacy contribute to these efforts? What are the roles of state-sponsored, non-state actor, and grassroots diplomacy in efforts to challenge illiberal democracy? And finally, to what degree has the erosion of democracy in the United States, India, Brazil, and among multiple member states of the European Union undercut the agency of nation states to promote democracy through diplomatic means? This conference will explore the work and the strategies being proposed and employed by practitioners and scholars of diplomacy across multiple vocations and contexts, which reflects the trans-professional lens through which the Gray School approaches the discipline of diplomatic studies. The mission of the Gray School is to train future practitioners of diplomacy across all vocations, from those pursuing careers in the Foreign Service to those who want to build bridges as NGO leaders, private sector actors, scientists, artists, religious leaders, community organizers, and activists. Our goal is to create cohorts of students with a wide range of vocational trajectories who engage the study and practice of diplomacy together, and in so doing, establish networks that they will take with them as they pursue or redirect their respective careers upon graduation. Examining the transprofessional diplomatic work which is currently taking place and which must now be amplified in the name of supporting democracy is the theme of our conference. To this end, we would like to invite everyone who joins us for this conference to consider themselves part of our global Gray School cohort. We're so grateful for the opportunity to learn from you and with you, and we look forward to doing so long into the future. I'd like to take this time to express my deepest gratitude to the extraordinary group of people who have made this conference possible, including Jeffrey Wiseman, the Gray School's endowed chair in applied diplomacy, Mildred Santiago, the Gray School's senior administrative assistant, and our IT team, Reina Nomura, Amanda Signore, and their 4 student assistants, Tirth, Divya, Neoma, and Dayo. Finally, I would like to give my greatest thanks to our students, whose energy, creativity, and enthusiasm for working as bridge builders in our world is the reason that all of us are here today. So let us now turn to our first keynote of the day. And to that end, let me turn things over to Jeff Wiseman, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much, David. And what a pleasure it is for me to introduce our opening keynote speaker today. Andy Knight is Distinguished Professor of International Relations in the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta. He was co-founder and head of the Diplomatic Academy of the Caribbean, and he established the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy. Andy is currently co-editor-in-chief of the journal African Security and co-editor-in-chief of International Journal, both globally recognized peer-reviewed publications. Professor Knight has written several books on the United Nations, global politics, building sustainable peace, remapping the Americas, and the responsibility to protect doctrine. One of his most recently published books is the award-winning Female Suicide Bombings, a critical gendered approach with Tanya Narojna. And his ongoing research and publications address issues of global health governance, global health security, children and war, the vulnerabilities and resilience of small island developing states, and changes in world order. In March 2021, Professor Knight was awarded the University of Alberta's highest honour, the University of Alberta Distinguished Professor. In 2021-22, he was Fulbright Distinguished Chair in International and Area Studies at Yale University. He joins us today from Edmonton, Alberta. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you very much, David. I really look forward to having the chance to speak to you here at the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, my topic is on democracy and good governance. And I should probably warn you that this is a topic that comes at a time when the international system is under severe attack. The tectonic plates of global governance are shifting right beneath us. We are living much more in an intermestic environment than international one. The pillars of Westphalia are crumbling before us. And in fact, one of those pillars, democracy, is under severe attack, even from those countries that are supposedly beacons of democracy. So I want to raise that as a sort of a caveat for everything I say after this. But I really want to look at the way in which the United Nations system in particular have been trying to shore up democracy and what needs to be done if we're going to shore up this particular ideal practice and norm of international relations. I think it would be difficult to dispute the proposition today that democracy has become universally accepted as a core value of the international system. But as recently as the late 1970s, there were only about 40 countries whose governments were considered democratic. This situation changed at the end of the Cold War, when the globe witnessed an exponential shift towards democratic governance. In the formal sense of civilian constitutional multi-party regimes, Larry Diamond once wrote, I think back in 1995, that there are now more democracies in the world than ever before. And in the final 2 decades of the last century, efforts to promote democracy and good governance globally has accelerated significantly. And as a result of this third wave of over 120 countries, representing roughly 2/3 of the global population, are now engaged one way or another in the process of building democratic systems of governance. And the United Nations system has been at the center of this activity, as you will find out in this talk. The United Nations Development Program spends roughly $1.5 billion annually to support democratic process around the world. And this makes the United Nations one of the largest providers of technical cooperation for democracy and good governance globally. However, the transition to democracy in many of these countries that we mentioned has been fleeting, imperiled, insecure, and fragile. And based on Freedom House criteria, right after the crest of this democratic wave, the third wave as we call it, 1/3 of the so-called democracies were not really free. Their elected leaders were sometimes constrained by non-elected and unaccountable groups within their jurisdictions, and such as rebel forces and other irregular militia. Political, ethnic, religious, internecine violence has frequently limited individual freedom in those polities and thus undermined or inhibited political competition. And the elected leaders have often suppressed the media, engaged in corruption, and stifled political opposition. Today, many democracies are threatened by a surge in populism and narrow nationalistic political forces. They also face corruption, political interference in the judicial system, uncompetitive elections, or brazen acts of aggression and grave atrocities. The latest findings of Freedom House suggest that 67 countries suffered net declines in their civil liberties and political rights. And this compares with 36 countries that have registered some gains in democracy. It is particularly troubling that some regressive populist and authoritarian behavior occurs in states that would normally be associated with beacons of democracy, including Brazil, France, Germany, the United States. There's been a noticeable democratic slippage in those countries, linked to a decline in civil liberties and political rights. Marina Ottaway once reminded us that in the last decade of the 20th century, there was a rise in semi-authoritarian regimes. That is, regimes that displayed characteristics of both democracy and authoritarianism. They are ambiguous systems that combine rhetorical acceptance of liberal democracy on the one hand, the existence of some formal democratic institutions in some cases, and a respect for a limited sphere of civil and political liberties, with essentially illiberal or even authoritarian traits. These regimes are in fact threatened by democracy and simply go through the motions of elections, directing certain institutions while resisting the kind of change that could threaten their power base. Vladimir Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey come to mind when it comes to these high-profile examples of states exhibiting such characteristics. Democratic governance is also threatened by emerging theocratic regimes, secessionists, terrorists, drug traffickers, organized criminals, state decay and failures, as well as by efforts of what they call footloose transnational capital and untamed globalization. More than any other contemporary observer of the democratization phenomena, David Held has warned of this disjunction between formal state authority and the realities of an emerging global system. The erosion of state autonomy by global activities of transnational corporations, combined with the nature of the porous national borders, suggests that democracy and good governance should be a concern of transnational, regional, and global intergovernmental organizations, as well as individual states. And in this context, the United Nations system has devoted much time, energy, and resources to the issue of democratic governance. The importance of this theme, I think, was stressed at the turn of the century in the Millennium Development Goals. At the Millennium Summit, democratic governance was invariably espoused by world leaders as central to the achievement of the MDGs. However, member states were faced with crime, corruption, weak administrative structures, unaccountable leadership, and the social and political exclusion of minorities. It was no surprise, therefore, that several of the fledgling democracies would quickly regress into undemocratic practices, resulting in the MDGs becoming even more elusive than ever before. Thus, the spread of democracy and good governance was expected to provide an enabling environment for achieving the MDGs. In fact, the Millennium Declaration still represents the most explicit statement to date by the UN member states in support of democratic and participatory governance. The General Assembly Resolution 55/2 of 18th of September 2000 approved that declaration, by which world leaders promised to spare no effort in promoting democracy, in strengthening the rule of law, and recognizing human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the right to development. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, 15 years later, crucially included in the SDGs, SDG 16, the need to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. I think we need to examine the United Nations' role in promoting and encouraging democracy and good governance. And the overall argument is that the United Nations system is in a position to help promote, strengthen the global norm, which posits that democracy validates governance in the contemporary world. And in order to consider democratic governments, in order to be considered democratic, governments should not only engage in running periodic, free, and fair elections, but also demonstrate the ability to govern inclusively and humanely, and to respect human rights and the rule of law. Thus, it is not sufficient for the United Nations to establish democracy simply as a process, in the sense intended by Joseph Schumpeter. The world body must also ensure that any state that considers itself as a democracy is adhering to certain normative governance principles and specific requirements of democracy, including constitutionally guaranteed rights, so as to prevent the erosion of liberty, the abuse of power, ethnic and international strife, and even the outbreak of violence. In addition, the United Nations must practice what it preaches and address its own democratic deficit. And I think this is one of the points I want to raise in this talk when we evaluate the extent to which the United Nations is succeeding or not in accomplishing those goals. So let me start by defining democracy and good governance. I know although we've used the word democracy often, it's become almost like a sort of standard term used in political science. Its meaning is essentially contested. Michael Seward once pointed out that the word is a signifier that evokes particular meanings in different people. Governments, dissidents, dictators, all claim it for their actions. Seward presents the example of General Musharraf, who overthrew the corrupt but elected government of Pakistan, Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, back in October 1999. After the coup, Musharraf was quoted as saying that he was instituting not martial law only as another path towards democracy. The armed forces had no intention of staying in charge any longer than is absolutely necessary to pave the way for true democracy to flourish in Pakistan. He went on to say that his leadership, that under his leadership, he would take Pakistan from the era of sham democracy to a true one and institute rolling series of local elections with the stipulation that 6 out of 21 seats in all of the local councils will be reserved for female candidates, for example. He claimed to have introduced democracy at the grassroots level and argued quite convincingly that democracy was not simply about elected government, but rather about how an elected government behaves, whether it is democratic in its disposition. Just when Musharraf seemed to be introducing nationwide elections, 9/11 occurred. And on the 30th of April 2002, Musharraf went to Pakistan, to Pakistanis, deployed the most democratic form of mechanism that we know, the referendum, and sought 5 more years in power. The new mandate allowed him to become a key player in the US-led fight against terrorism. But clearly, Musharraf's democracy model was quite different from, say, that of the United States. Did this make Pakistan version any less democratic than the United States one? Now, the United States is commonly regarded as a beacon of democracy. Its Declaration of Independence was not only about the right to self-determination, but also about the establishment of a democracy, a republican democracy. But the US's form was quite different from classical notions of democracy. You go back to James Madison, the 4th president, in the Federalist Papers, number 10, who clarified the nature of US democracy and made a distinction between a strictly democratic Athenian-style democracy and a republic, whereas the former would consist of a society of small number of citizens who assembled to administer the government in person. The latter would be a government in which the scheme of representation was paramount. And being a republic was considered necessary for the United States because of its vast land expanse. Madison's objective was to create a governance system that would control a country with continental proportions. Now, such a system would not allow individual citizens to play a direct political role in running the country. Instead, an electoral college was developed that allows citizens periodically to elect representatives to carry out the country's business in Washington. And in this system, a presidential candidate can get the most popular votes, as we know nationally, and still lose the election on account of having fewer electoral college votes. And this, in fact, of course, happened in 2000 and 2016 presidential races, in which Albert Gore and Hillary Clinton both had the more popular votes nationally than George Bush on the one hand and Donald Trump on the other, but still lost the presidency in those races. The race in 2000 boiled down to the results in Florida, as we all know, where there were serious questions existing about the fairness and the equality of the vote. And in the end, the Supreme Court made a decision on the outcome. And Hillary Clinton in 2016 won the popular vote by almost 3 million people, a margin that's 5 times the margin garnered by Gore, but still lost the presidency. Noam Chomsky reminds us that the United States form of democracy was based on protecting the opulent minority from the tyranny of the majority. He quotes James Madison as saying that political power ought to be in the hands of the wealth of the nation. That is, those men, because not very many women were included, could be trusted to secure the permanent interests of the country, the rights of the propertied, and to defend those interests against the leveling spirit of those who labor under the hardship of life and secretly sigh for more equal distribution of its blessings. That's a quote from James Madison. Now, democracy has different meanings, and such factors as local language, history, knowledge, level of trust, religion. These are conditions that shape the meaning and that's conveyed by the term democracy. But according to the Greek origin of the term, democracy means rule of the people. Demos means people, kratos means authority or power. It is a system of government in which supreme authority lies with the people. The governance in a democracy can be direct or indirect, but the governors can only rule with the consent of the governed, whether or not a trustee or delegate form of political representation is utilized. The United Nations operational definition of democracy has the following characteristics. Government decisions made in consultation with the country's citizens or via elected representatives. Frequent and fair elections of representatives who exercise their constitutional powers without violent opposition from unelected officials. Universal adult suffrage. All adults have the right to run for public office. Freedom of expression without the risk of state punishment. Free access to alternative sources of information that are protected by law. Freedom of association. And all citizens have the right to form independent associations and organizations, including independent political parties and interest groups. Amartya Sen was provided a snapshot of the current status of this form of governance. And he said, while democracy is not yet universally practiced, nor indeed uniformly accepted, in the general climate of world opinion, democratic governance has now achieved the status of being taken to be generally right. The ball is very much in the court of those who want to rubbish democracy to provide justification for that rejection. So the term governance has been long associated with democracy, coming from the Greek word meaning to steer. Governance, which can be for either good or evil ends. Major donors and international financial institutions have been increasingly conditioning their aid and loans on states that ensure good governance. As argued later on in my talk, African states in particular, states in transition, call them states in transition, sometimes failed states, failing states, have more often than not to be the main targets for the implementation of such good governance measures. The term good governance is often used to refer to the promotion of the rule of law and equal justice under the law, and to a governing process that ensures that political, social, economic priorities of a state are based on broad consensus within its civil society. In addition, good governance is now generally accepted to mean a process through which governments actively address socioeconomic problems facing their citizens. Kofi Annan has once noted that good governance is perhaps the single most important factor in eradicating poverty and promoting development. Another take on good governance can be found in Article 9.3 of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement between the European Union and 77 countries of sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, the ACP countries. And this article specifies that good governance is the transparent and accountable management of human, natural, economic, and financial resources for the purposes of equitable and sustainable development in the context of a political and institutional environment that upholds human rights, democratic principles, and the rule of law. Other definitions of good governance focus on social political concerns, while yet others reveal a more technocratic and technical economic side. A brief overview of Donner's definition illustrates this very well. For example, in the International Monetary Fund, good governance refers generally to the technical economic aspects of governance, the transparency of government accounts, the effectiveness of public resource management, and the stability and the regulations, stability of the regulatory environment for private sector activity. In the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, the term focuses on the social dimensions to build, strengthen, and promote democratic institutions, as well as tolerance throughout society. Whereas in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, there's a stress on political, legal dimensions of global governance. For example, the legitimacy of the government, the accountability of political elements of government, and respect for human rights and the rule of law. By good governance, therefore, it is meant as a process of decision-making that is participatory, inclusive, transparent, accountable, responsible, effective, and efficient. And those elements are closely interrelated, and ideally all six aspects would be expected to work in synergy for good governance to exist. Now let me take a look at the United Nations and democratic governance. Lawrence Finkelstein, a great colleague of mine, a former mentor in some ways of mine, reminds us that democracy does not appear in the United Nations Charter, either as a condition of membership or as a goal of the United Nations system. Neither is it mentioned in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, nor is it mentioned in Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although there is reference in the latter to human freedom, including freedom of religion and assembly. The word is also not to be found anywhere in the Charter of the International Monetary Fund or in the Articles and Agreements for 5 institutions comprising the World Bank Group. Yet the ideal of democratic governance underpins much of what the United Nations contemporary work is all about today. When the world body was founded, in addition to being an alliance against aggression, it was premised on the belief that stable, peaceful conditions within states would underpin peaceful and stable relations between states. But when did the UN become preoccupied with advancing and promoting democracy? Well, it began in 1989, in December of 1989, when the General Assembly, in its resolution 44/146, finally took the stand that political legitimacy required democracy. This text underscores the significance of both the United Nations, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights and the International Civil and Political Rights Convention, both of which had established earlier the authority to govern, that the authority to govern shall be based on the will of the people, as expressed in periodic and genuine elections. With the fall of the Berlin Wall a month earlier, there was a surge in democratic entitlement that began, and democracies started to acquire the status of a global norm. That same year, the United Nations supervised the Namibian election in its transition from trusteeship to independence. The first time I think that the organization became engaged in democratic interventionism that combined traditional peacekeeping and observer tasks with actual institutional development. In February of the following year, the United Nations launched its first electoral observer mission within a member state in Nicaragua. And this was followed a year later by a similar kind of mission in Haiti. In 1991, the Assembly took major steps in adopting, first of all, Resolution 46/137 to enhance the robustness of the global democracy norm. That text reaffirmed principles stated in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and noted what would enhance the effectiveness of the principle of periodic and genuine elections, that everyone has the right to take part in the government of his or her country, either directly or through the freely chosen representatives, and everyone has a right of equal access to public service in his or her country. The will of the people should be based on the authority of government. The people's will shall be expressed in the periodic genuine elections, which should be held by secret ballot, and universal and equal suffrage shall be accepted as the norm. Now, this resolution also referred to the provision in the ICCPR for every citizen to take part in the conduct of public affairs without distinction of any kind, including distinctions of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. It used this principle to condemn the apartheid regime in South Africa and also in Rhodesia, and Rhodesia's systematic denial of the right of Black people to vote. The Assembly also recognized that there was no single political system or electoral method equally suited to every country. Therefore, any attempt to assist in the implementation of periodic and genuine elections should not call into question each state's sovereign right to choose and develop its own unique political, socioeconomic, cultural system. Although by 1991, the United Nations was providing advisory services and technical assistance to the Center for Human Rights to states that asked for help in their transition to democracy. In addition, technical assistance was being provided by the Department of Technical Cooperation for Development and the United Nations Development Program. Since 1991, according to the Department of Political Affairs, at the time called the Department of Political Affairs, the United Nations has given direct technical electoral assistance to over 100 countries. But before it can provide any type of electoral assistance, the United Nations first evaluates the pre-election conditions in that country that's requesting assistance. And this is followed by a procedure that is then followed for a government to obtain help. First, the state must send an official written request for assistance to the United Nations focal point for electoral assistance activities at least 3 months before the election is to be held, to allow for meaningful involvement. Usually those making the country's requests are from the national electoral authorities of that country, the Office of the President, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And second, the Electoral Assistance Division will then consult with the relevant regional divisions of the DPA, Department of Public Affairs, and the United Nations Residential Coordinator, among others, on whether the pre-election conditions in the requesting country satisfy the establishment of a UN Electoral Assistance Committee. And third, if the focal point determines that an in-depth assessment of the pre-election conditions is required before deciding whether to provide assistance, the Electoral Assistance Division, in cooperation with the United Nations Development Program, will then dispatch a needs assessment mission to evaluate the political, material, institutional, and security situation in the requesting country. Fourth, the mission will also assess the appropriateness and necessity and potential impact of the United Nations assistance to ascertain whether the main contesting political parties in that country and the civil society representatives support the organization's involvement. Now, this just shows the extent to which the UN doesn't want to foist onto countries their own concept of what democracy is, and wants to see sort of a bottom-up approach to democracy. I'm going to skip over a section here that I wrote on the number and types of assistance that were given to the various countries that asked for assistance in terms of transitioning to democracy, just in the interest of time. But I want to get to this very important point. It should be noted that while democracy can be assimilated by all countries' traditional cultures, the United Nations is not in the business of foisting upon states any specific model of democracy. Boutros Boutros Ghali, in his agenda for Democratization noted that in order for democracy to take root, it would have to derive from society itself. Each society must be able to choose the form, the pace, the character of its democratic processes. And with this in mind, the United Nations has aimed to support democratization of states in a variety of processes and experiences that focus on providing assistance and advice to those states making a formal request for United Nations help in this area. And over the years since 1989, at the end of the Cold War, the United Nations has developed two main types of electoral assistance. The first is a standard electoral assistance, and the second consists of major electoral missions, usually conducted alongside peacekeeping and peace-building operations. And I would refer you to a chapter I wrote on this topic that's published in Tom Meese's book, dealing with global governance. There are a number of countries that have undertaken those type of assistances for transition to democracy. The ones that are most important, I think, are the major electoral missions. Major electoral missions must be given the authority by the General Assembly or the Security Council, who will, and they're only considered in exceptional cases. They're normally a core part of a comprehensive peacekeeping operation. And the following three types of electoral assistance activities fall in this category. The first is the organization and actual conduct of an election. The second is a major electoral mission, is also seldom undertaken by the United Nations and involves the supervision of an electoral process, usually in the context of decolonization or trusteeship. And in such cases, a special representative of the Secretary General is normally appointed to certify the results, as well as report on the fairness and appropriateness of an entire process. And the example of this is the 1989 United Nations Transition Assistance Group that supervised the elections leading to the independence of Namibia, for example. And the final is a major electoral activity, which is usually a verification process conducted by the United Nations. Now, the final point I want to make is about international financial institutions and good governance. Now, good governance and political liberalization as desirable ends were imposed on African governments by external actors. And we've seen this with the IMF and the World Bank, conditionality and the structural adjustment programs. But this has become a way in which the United Nations can actually sort of decide on how governments transitioning to democracy can be given assistance or given funding for that transition. Since 1991, more than 100 countries have requested and received electoral assistance from the United Nations. Some states had more than one request for help with presidential or parliamentary elections. In some cases, they needed technical assistance with administration of elections, with the drafting and reviewing of electoral laws and regulations, with resolving electoral disputes, delimiting electoral boundaries, administering voter registration, projecting election budgeting, providing logistics, procuring election materials, and utilizing technologies, training election officials, educating voters, managing voting, counting operations, providing election security and coordination of international donor assistance. And as I noted earlier, in some rare transitional cases, the United Nations is asked to take complete charge of organizing the election of a member state. And in rare cases, the United Nations experts are brought in to supplement a country's electoral administration. In such cases, the responsibility is generally shared by the member states and the United Nations system. An example is Afghanistan in 2004, 2005, or Iraq in 2005. But the general rule is that the United Nations tends to take on a supporting role in assisting the national electoral administrators of countries that request electoral assistance. And since 2002, there have been at least 51 cases in which the United Nations was simply unable to fulfill the requests of states that were asking for assistance. The reason being either lack of funding or insufficient lead time. And finally, there were a few cases in which states simply withdrew their requests And in at least one case in Togo, the United Nations technical assistance was suspended because an election was postponed. Basically, we are living in a transitional moment in international relations where I think both the domestic and the international have become so intertwined. It's very difficult to govern under those circumstances. But the United Nations has tried its best, despite the fact that they think it's a decision frozen in time, 1945 time. It has tried its best to sort of deal with democratic practices and tried to live up to this norm of democracy. But global democracy has to move in two different directions simultaneously. It has to first be deepened through democratic participation at the lower levels, local, national, and regional, while broadening at the higher levels of global decision-making. And in assisting states that are in need of consolidating their democratic processes, and in insisting on such processes be linked to good governance, the United Nations system has been making an important contribution to deepening the democratic participation. But democratic practices can be further broadened at the global level if the United Nations member states, working with the current Secretary General, can choose to eliminate the democratic deficits that are present even within the United Nations system itself. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Andy, thanks so much for that wonderful, it was a tour de force of the problems of trying to promote the global democracy norm that you describe. And I think in a way, in the face of the UN Security Council's apparent inability to do something demonstrable in relation to the civil war in Syria, in relation to the war in Ukraine, we do tend to forget, I think, the things that the United Nations does under the radar in terms of promoting democratic governance, including, as you pointed out, I think very, very nicely, some bottom-up practices. So for taking us through this very contested concept, democracy, democratization, I want to thank you so much for joining us today from Canada. And I'm now going to close this session with my thanks to Andy and invite everyone to return at the top of the hour for our very first panel, which is on democratic backsliding, where we look at 3 specific cases that Andy touched on one way or another. So thank you, Andy, and we will see you all again at the top of the hour. Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you.